On a recent trip to Saudi Arabia, President Obama was photographed in an apparent bow to the King of Saudi Arabia. Now, critics lambasted President Obama for supposedly showing too much deference or too much subordination to Saudi Arabia, while many proponents of President Obama defended the president, saying that, simply enough, it's a show of respect. And even the famed political satirist Stephen Colbert jumped in on the conversation and said that what else are you going to do when the Saudi Arabian president is only 5 feet tall? You can crouch, you can bow, but somehow you have to be able to shake his hand. Now, interestingly enough, this rather minuscule episode of a bow is actually fairly representative of the shape of Saudi Arabian news and Saudi Arabian actions in recent events. Specifically, whereas in the heyday in the 1960s and even into the 1990s, Saudi Arabia always seemed to be in the news, whether creating a new oil spike or creating a new influence in the Middle Eastern region. But now, as we enter the 21st century, it seems that Saudi Arabia is losing much of its influence, and the only newsworthy action is indeed President Obama bowing or not bowing to the King of Saudi Arabia. And thus, concerning the fact that Saudi Arabia now seems to be declining in its influence and its actions in the Middle Eastern region, many political analysts are asking themselves today's essential question. Specifically, is Saudi Arabia losing its influence in the Middle East? And the answer to that question is, unfortunately, yes. Saudi Arabia is indeed losing its influence in the Middle Eastern region, specifically for three main areas of analysis. The first being that, simply enough, Iran is now growing in power in the Middle East. Secondly, because its influence and the relationship with the West, specifically with the United States, is decreasing for Saudi Arabia. And third and finally, because simply enough, Saudi Arabia is dealing with too many internal problems in order to maintain its influence in the rest of the Middle East. Now let's look to our first area of analysis, namely that in Saudi Arabia is now losing control or losing its front-runner influence to the country of Iran. Specifically, as Robert Kaplan, a senior advisor of foreign affairs, reminds us in April of 2014, he states that Saudi Arabia now finds a new rival in the Middle Eastern region, specifically in its geopolitical rival of the nation of Iran. Now, Saudi Arabia is a majority Sunni Islam country, meaning that it practices the Sunni or the majority sect of Islam known as Sunni Islam. In comparison, Iran, as the sworn enemy of Saudi Arabia, instead practices the minority sect of Shiite Islam. Now, the divergent religious reactions and religious dispositions of these two countries often make Iran and Saudi Arabia great geopolitical rivals. And in fact, as Kaplan goes on to say, is that Iran has recently taken more action in the Middle Eastern region, has now effectively set up a puppet regime in Iraq, as a Shiite Muslim regime now is in control in the Iraqi government, and it seems that Iran is the one to blame or the one to take credit for creating a Shiite Muslim regime in Iraq. Moreover, according to a Time magazine article from April 14, 2014, labeled "The King and President Obama," it reminds us that Saudi Arabia also feels threatened in the countries of Bahrain and neighboring Yemen, as Iran has increasingly lended its support to the minority Shiites, and it does indeed seem again that Iran is gaining in strength and extending its influence into various Middle Eastern countries. And thus, considering the rise of Iran, it seems that the influence is indeed declining in the country of Saudi Arabia. Now let's move on to our second point, and we'll see how Saudi Arabia is also losing its relationship or its influence on the United States, a clear indication that it is also losing control in the Middle East. Specifically, according to Prince Bashir al-Fassad, a senior foreign policy analyst of the King of Saudi Arabia, he reminds us that Saudi Arabia recently feels abandoned, or that it's losing its trust and its control over its relationship with the United States. Specifically, a Brookings Data Center report in April reminds us that the United States has recently been less appealing or more resistant in following Saudi Arabian desires. As in the country of Syria, as Saudi Arabia fervently pushed for the toppling of the Assad regime, the United States instead withdrew and did not go back and did not fulfill its promise of attacking Assad after the use of chemical weapons. Now really the main thing to remember is that although Saudi Arabia fervently had a desire to topple the Assad regime, its traditional ally in the United States did not go up on these goals. And thus this decline or this lack of following through on Saudi Arabian desires is a clear indication that without its Western allies or its Western support, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is indeed losing its support and its influence in the Middle East, as it simply doesn't even have enough control to convince its Western allies to also go on the Middle East and act upon Saudi Arabian desires. But now let's move on to our third and final point, and we'll see how the Saudi Arabian government is now dealing with its own domestic problems to the point that since it has so many issues at home, it simply can't maintain its influence in the rest of the Middle Eastern region. Specifically, according to a Human Rights Watch report dated in April 2014, it reminds us that many liberal reforms such as freer internet or less censorship are now being rolled back in the country of Saudi Arabia, meaning that many young Saudi Arabians are now in immense distress and unrest at the fact that its government is now rolling back many of its civil freedoms. And thus it seems that there will be much outcry and much instability in the country of Saudi Arabia simply because it's now rolling back many of its liberal reforms. Moreover, according to an International Monetary Fund report also dated in April 2014, it states that the unemployment rate among the youth of Saudi Arabia is over 30%, meaning that not only are they losing many of their civil freedoms, many young people in Saudi Arabia are also losing their jobs and their economic sustainability. And thus, considering these domestic problems, it's not a too far cry, it's not too far of a guess to say that there's going to be more outcry and more unrest in the country of Saudi Arabia. And thus, with this domestic outcry, it's clear that with so many domestic problems, Saudi Arabia will simply not be able to maintain its influence in the Middle East, and we'll see its influence continue to decline further. But now, in conclusion, the three main reasons why Saudi Arabia is indeed losing its influence in the Middle East are: first, because Iran is growing in its geopolitical power; secondly, because it's finding a less support from its Western allies in the United States; and third and finally, because of growing domestic problems, it seems that Saudi Arabia is now losing its ability to maintain its influence in the Middle East. So now, unfortunately, although it seems that Saudi Arabia is losing its influence in the Middle East, hopefully if it creates more liberal reforms or more stability with its allies, instead of the Middle East not bowing to Saudi Arabia, the Middle East will again bow to Saudi Arabia.